just getting over jet lag, so I appreciate being here very early on a Sunday morning. I guess this was really the starting point, this case was really the starting point of me getting into the Kennedy assassinations with my film, RFK Must Die, in 2008 on the 40th anniversary of that killing, and also my book, Who Killed Bobby, which came out the same year. And I kind of re-entered the case. Well, I mean, I've been campaigning with a small group to reopen the case for ever since I did that kind of book. But I kind of did some new research on the case earlier this year because Sirhan has a parole hearing every 5 years, and it rolled around in February 2016. So I decided that I had a lot of archive material that I'd basically gathered during my kind of research period since the book and film that I wanted to put out there and make it public in support of a campaign to try and release Sirhan, however difficult that challenge might be. So what I did was I did a 3-week online campaign in the lead up to the parole hearing itself, and that's located at sirhanvsirhan.com. So some of the materials generated, which I'll talk about in my presentation. But before I do that, I realized that this is mainly a JFK conference, and that some of you might not be up to speed on the Bobby Kennedy case. So what I did was I put together a 7-minute campaign video for that. Which I'm going to kick off with this morning, just to get you up to speed on some of the key things, and also to get a sense of who Sirhan was back in 1968 and who he is recently. So the most recent video we'll see of him is from 2011, because when I went back to try and cover the parole hearing in 2016, I found out that video and audio recording of his parole hearings are now been banned. So we can no longer see him in video, audio. The only image we have of him, possibly from here on out, is a mugshot, which says, all that needs to be said of the parole system in California and the justice system. So as I said, here's the video, and hopefully it'll give you an overview of the case before I come back.
Sirhan, this is a question that I think the doctors asked you several times. If you had 3 wishes now, what would they be?
I wish that Senator Kennedy was still alive. I wish that every day that I've been. Second one, that there should be peace in the Middle East.
How you doing, Mr. Sirhan?
Good afternoon.
Your seat right there. This is a subsequent number 13 parole consideration hearing for Sirhan Sirhan, and the inmate was received on 5/23/69 from Los Angeles County. The inmate received a term originally of the death sentence, which was reduced in August 16, 1971 to life with the possibility of parole. The victim of the homicide was the Senator Robert Kennedy, Kennedy.
So my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
He still has the gun. The gun is pointed at me at this moment. I hope they can get the gun out of his hand. They have the gun away from the man.
Dr. Noguchi, were you able to determine how far the gun muzzle was from Senator Kennedy's head?
One gunshot wound was found behind the right ear. After testifying the similar weapon, we came to conclusion that the muzzle distance would be a 1 inch from the right ear edge.
Frank Burns was the leader of Kennedy's California campaign. He was standing near the senator at the time of the shooting.
You don't think the gun was any closer than this?
No, never closer than 1.5 to 2 feet.
And you know the theory is that the gun was held about this close.
But wasn't that gun?
Or this close.
It wasn't that gun.
No way?
No way.
The capacity of Sirhan's gun was 8 shots. He did not have time to reload. And so anything more than 8 shots proves there had to be a second gun firing within that kitchen pantry, period. Sirhan could not have shot Robert Kennedy. It certainly could not have fired the fatal bullet. So what does that mean? It means that Sirhan was convicted for a crime, which he did not commit. So it is the responsibility of the judicial system, the criminal justice system, to rectify that error.
My name is Sirhan. 17 days from today, I will be 67 years old. I was born in Jerusalem and raised by devoutly Christian parents. I have been a practicing Christian all of my life, and even now I attend church every week. I believe that it is my ultimate faith in God, which has given me the strength to get through the last 45 years of my incarceration.
My eyes were full of tears, and he looked at me, his eyes were full of tears. And he said, Mom, I know now this time you're never going to believe me, but I'm telling you the truth, that I don't remember I killed Senator Robert Kennedy. I don't remember.
So what do you remember about the shooting, if you're willing to talk about that?
I was there. But I don't remember the exact moment. I don't remember pulling my gun out of my body or wherever it was located. And I don't remember aiming at any human being. I don't remember any of that in Missouri prison. And I've said that from the get-go.
Let me end tonight with Bobby Kennedy, the hero we lost 45 years ago tonight. He was shot by a Palestinian angry at Kennedy's pro-Israeli campaign appeal. Sirhan was, if you think about it, an early case of Mideast terrorism directed at the United States.
You said that at Corcoran, I believe it was, they alleged that you were somehow responsible for the downing of the Twin Towers?
No, not they did. And then they just hauled me into
what did you say to that?
Curiosity. I said, you guys are crazy. I never did that. I don't know anything about it.
Tell the chairman about the time when, during this whole time, when you were in the shower and you came out of the shower. Do you recall you had a towel around you?
Oh, yeah. I go into the shower and I want to walk to my cell, and I put my towel on top of my head and just have it there on my head, and I walk to my cell and have the officer open the door, so I can finish drying my body. And all of a sudden, I'm an Arab, and I'm a part of the conspiracy, Middle Eastern conspiracy. I'm a terrorist, and I'm this, and I'm that. And there's no truth to that. I always did that. And
you're a Christian now?
Yeah, I'm always a Christian. Okay. I was born a Christian.
Did you have a Quran with you at some point? Wasn't there some evidence found in the Quran?
I have a Quran, and I have a Bible, and I have other religious books from other faiths.
But your faith
Quran
is Christian.
It's Christian. I have a Bible in Arabic for that matter, and I have the Quran. The Quran that I use it helps me when I read it. It helps me keep my my Arabic up.
Okay. What is your favorite book of the New Testament?
Oh, I think the whole Bible is my favorite book, but I would say maybe Psalms.
That's the Old Testament. The New Testament is.
The New Testament. I like that expression in Luke 4:16 to 3. Okay. I like that very much because it instills and renews my hope that sooner or later I will be found suitable for parole again, because Christ promised that to all the believers.
All right, we're back on record. Time is 5:30. In the matter of Sirhan, CDC number B as in boy, 21014. The panel has reviewed all the information received from the public and all relevant information that was before us today, and have concluded the prisoner is not yet suitable for parole and would pose an unreasonable risk of danger or threat to public safety if released from prison.
Everyone. getting justice in his case. So I just want to go through his case with you. So that's the title of the presentation. Okay, my clicker is working. Good. Also draw attention to the fact that today is Bobby Kennedy's 91st birthday. It would have been Bobby Kennedy's 91st birthday. And again, one of his oft-quoted statements during his campaign: to tame the savages of man and make gentle the life of the world. And we're a long way from that, So obviously we lost a huge amount during that '68 campaign. Thank you. So just the state of the case. I guess after being involved in it for so long, my key feeling about it is that I'm interested in research, not just for the sake of it, but for the sake of building a case, and even though it's a long shot, trying to get him out of prison and trying to get justice in the case, which is also a position shared by Paul Schrade, who was walking behind Bobby Kennedy that night and was actually shot in the head by Sirhan in all probability. And again, he seeks justice for Bobby Kennedy and justice for Sirhan. So I'm going to present what I think are the strongest elements of the evidence that you've got some insight into from the video there, and just give you a kind of a state of the case as I see it this morning. So Sirhan is now 72 years old, so he spent 2/3 of his life in prison. He was 24 years old at the time of the shooting itself. In 1975, due to quite progressive prison authorities and a prison regime in California, he was actually granted a parole date of 1986, which was then brought forward for good behavior to 1984. And then as part of a campaign to become Attorney General in 1981, there was a 10-day rescission hearing held in 1982 where his parole date was rescinded. And basically, there's been very little way back for him since then. But essentially, up to that point in '82, what was fascinated me about going through it in this campaign for the parole hearing was getting, through a Freedom of Information request, all of the progress reports for his behavior in prison, the 10-day rescission, the transcripts to the 10-day rescission parole hearings, and then all transcripts for the parole hearing sessions that have taken place since then, and they're very eye-opening in terms of shining a light on what's happened to Sirhan since '68 and '69 when his trial took place, and how he really has been an exemplary prisoner, despite lots of provocation from his fellow prisoners and also from the guards and the prison system, as he struggled obviously to remember anything about the shooting, and also to come to terms with being labelled the first Arab terrorist and being labelled the lone gunman in the case. He's been denied paroles since 14 times since then, the last in February this year, and I'll come to that later. And he's consistently stated he has no memory of the shooting, as his mother said there in the video, and as he's really said from day one. So we'll go into that as well. I mean, basically, Dr. Dan Brown is the latest psychologist who's worked with him since 2008. He spent over 100 hours over several, I guess probably a dozen sessions, visiting him in the various prisons where Sirhan's been since that time, trying to recover his memory, and through regression to take him back to that night and to try and reenact the shooting and get clues as to potential conspirators who may have set him up for this, and to try and jog his memory in some way. So this is an early mugshot. This was actually, you can see on it, it's called John Doe number 1. So this was taken literally hours after the shooting, when Sirhan would still not tell investigators or police officers who had him in custody his name, and really had no idea where he was or why he was there. And that's borne out by audio. We have pretty much audio of the whole time he was in custody up to his arraignment at 7 o'clock that morning. The shooting took place at around 12:16, just after midnight. And the audio corroborates the fact that he really didn't know where he was. He was just chit-chatting with the police officers, and his blood was not tested, so we don't know if he had taken drugs. We know that he had had 4 Tom Collins cocktails that evening, and perhaps they played into all this. But basically, that's why he was booked as John Doe, and Kennedy was obviously still alive and survived for just over a day before his death. So I think the key evidence, for me anyway, to present in terms of overturning his conviction are the two firing positions that we're somewhat acquainted with so far after William's speech and the video. I'll go into those in a second. Sirhan's gun was, the barrel of his gun was 2 feet in front of Kennedy. 1.5 to 5 feet is the general witness summary of the witness statements. And the second gun was 1 inch behind the right ear, as Dr. Noguchi has stated was his verdict in the autopsy report. So we seem to have 2 different firing positions. The Brzezinski audio recording indicates that there were 13 shots from 2 guns, from those 2 firing positions. Sirhan in front and a second gunman from behind. We also have the whole idea of Sirhan as Manchurian candidate to explain why he can't remember the shooting, and also to explain his glassy-eyed stare at the time of the shooting, and his immense calm and his strength after the shooting as they were trying to get the gun off him. So all indicators that he wasn't in his right state of mind, and indeed the defense and prosecution psychiatrists who examined him before the trial, they also agreed that he was in a hypnotic state at the time of the shooting. But again, this was all looked at with somewhat scorn by the jury and the prosecution during the trial. But they didn't know at the time about MKUltra and all the CIA experiments in the 50s to create just such a Manchurian candidate and a programmed assassin. So, who was seen in the pantry with Sirhan by the trace stacker just before they were seen together, just before the shooting happened, and then who fled down a flight of stairs and was seen by Sandy Serrano exclaiming, "We shot him, we killed Kennedy." So I'll be talking a little bit about that. And then the key supporters who can help us to try and reopen the case, and where do we go from here. So to come back to Sirhan's gun, this is the Ivor Johnson 22 caliber revolver. It held 8 bullets. All bullets were expended. So Sirhan, we know, fired 8 shots, but obviously with the Brzezinski recording, 13 shots. So there were 5 other shots from behind, and they're the ones we believe that did the damage. So, quite a tiny revolver that was sitting in his car, and he'd been drinking the 4 Tom Collins, and he went back to his car and he was going to drive home, but he thought he was too drunk to drive home. And at that point, he seems to have got the gun from the car and come back into the hotel. And then he after he meets the girl in Polkadot dress, and they have coffee together, he kind of blacks out for a couple of hours before he's awakes as he's choked on the steam table. So that blackout in his memory is really what he's trying to recover here, and where the gun came from, because he really has very little memory of it. So just in terms of the actual crime scene itself, we can see here, this is the pantry. You can see the X on the floor marks the head of Bobby Kennedy and where it fell. He fell backwards. The man, I think he's a press reporter that the police asked to stand in and model where they feel Sirhan was when he fired the shots. And just at the edge of the steam table is where, just at the edge of the steam table is where basically Kennedy had stopped to stand here and turned to shake hands with some waiters and busboys. And then he had just turned again, and he was walking east through the pantry into a conference room to give a late night press conference. So he had come off the stage. If I go to the next slide, and here we see the tray stacker. Oops, sorry. Here we see the tray stacker just here that Sirhan was supposedly standing on, because he was quite a short guy, and he was standing on with the girl in polka dot dress next to him. And then he brushed past Lisa Urso, and apparently came up here and put his arm around Carl Euchre's left shoulder, and then started firing. So just to orientate you, and you can see from all the ceiling tiles how 3 bullets later apparently went into the ceiling because of the sharp upward trajectory of Sirhan's gunshots. So that was some of the damage after the event. If we turn it around, we can see the famous picture of the fallen Bobby Kennedy with busboy Juan Romero cradling him and handling him rosary beads. And we see the bow tie of Thane Eugene Caesar, who was the security guard who had led Kennedy through the pantry. As Kennedy came off the stage, he had taken Kennedy by the right elbow with his left hand and literally led him into the killing zone. And as Kennedy fell, it seems Tame Eugene Caesar also fell, and he lost his bow tie, which gives us a lasting testimony to where he was at the moment of the gunshots, right in the position described in the autopsy. So he really, over the years, he's been suspect number one in terms of the second gunman. Okay.
Is he still alive?
He is. I mean, he's supposedly in the Philippines, and he's a very tight relationship with Dan Moldea, who's a very contested figure in the case. He thought Caesar was the second gunman, and then he did a complete U-turn and is now basically Caesar's agent. When I approached Caesar through Moldea for an interview at the time I did my film and my book, I was quoted a figure of $50,000 for him to speak to me, and that would go through Moldea, who is supposedly an objective author in the case. So just and Moldea is actually the godfather for some of Caesar's kids. So how twisted is that? So this is moving on to Paul Schrade. Then this is Bobby Kennedy, and this is Paul Schrade standing next to him on the stage, just moments before the shooting occurred. This is the beginning of Kennedy's speech, just shortly after midnight. And then this is the two of them in the pantry. So you see Kennedy's head and the blood pooling by his right ear, and then you see the shoe of Paul Schrade. So you can see how close they were together. Paul Schrade believes he was walking 6 to 8 feet behind Paul Schrade when the shooting happened. And actually, we believe that the first shot actually hit Paul Schrade in the head. It didn't kill him, it was just a flesh wound, and he survived to kind of campaign on Bobby Kennedy and Sirhan's behalf. But you can see the proximity of the two of them in the pantry, and there Paul Schrade is lying on the floor with the gunshot, the scalp wound that I've just mentioned. And again, you can see here the X where Paul Schrade's head was and where Bobby Kennedy's was in terms of their... So it seems that Sirhan started firing. Paul Schrade, 6'3", 6'4". Obviously, Bobby Kennedy kind of got out of the way and missed the first shot. It hit Paul Schrade in the head. And then it looks like then some of the shots went through the shoulder pad or went through under the arm of Bobby Kennedy, one going to the ceiling, one lodging in his neck, and then the kill shot, which would have floored him. So according to all the witnesses, Paul Schrade fell first, according to Eddie Menasian, who was one of the hotel maitre d's, who was with his colleague Carl Juncker. Schrade fell first, then Kennedy fell, and obviously the kill shot an inch behind the right ear would have floored anybody. So that gives you an idea of the sequence of the shots. So we turn around then and we look at the swinging doors on the west side of the pantry. This is the direction that Kennedy came off stage, and he walked through the swinging doors, walked into the pantry towards these steam tables that we've been talking about. And then you can just see here, there's a center divider in the middle of the swing doors where they found 2 bullet holes, and where FBI agent Bill Bailey was there in the hours after the shooting, and he actually saw bullet holes lodged in those holes, which again indicates that there were more bullets fired in that pantry that Sirhan's gun could have held. So if we move it on, just sticking with Paul Schrade. Apparently, according to Dwayne Wolfer, who's the slightly larger man in front of Thomas Noguchi there in the photograph, both of them went back to the crime scene when we were trying to use the findings of the autopsy report to kind of figure out exactly what had happened and which bullet went where. You can see the sharp upward angle of the 2 shots that impacted on Kennedy's body and went through the shoulder, under his arm and through his shoulder. One was lost in the ceiling space, and one went clean through his jacket and also had that sharp upward trajectory. So then when Wolfer later accounted for where all the bullets had gone, he said that one of those 2 shots had actually passed through the shoulder pad of Kennedy's coat, gone right to left, back to front, and hit Paul Schrade in the head. Which is just ridiculous. But there was a very tight accounting of the bullets, so he had to do that. It was a bit like a magic bullet. He had to do that in order to make 9 shots or 10 or 11 or 12 shots fit the 8 bullets in Sirhan's gun. But on the face of it, it's just ridiculous. And Paul Schrade has said, I'd have to be basically sitting on Bobby Kennedy's head for those shots to work. But again, there was very little interest in pursuing this at the time of his trial. And indeed, Grant Cooper, Sirhan's attorney, he stipulated to the evidence. He didn't even question the ballistics in the case. Okay, so moving on, there's some other photos of the pantry, and again you can see that center divider in relation to where everything was. And here's just, I think some of the slide is a bit clipped, but I'll read it for you. 4 shots hit Kennedy, 3 hit his body, 1 passed through his jacket. There were 5 other shooting victims and 2 bullet holes, as we can see, in the pantry door frame. There was also 1 in a door hinge. Through those swinging doors, there was a door hinge from the anteroom coming off the stage, and they also found a bullet hole lodged in that. So if you add those up, that's already 12 bullets. Which the Brzezinski recording kind of verifies in the fact that they now hear at least 13 shot sounds on the Brzezinski recording. So yeah, the Brzezinski recording, I think it's been a great boost for the case. It came along pretty much around the time of my book and around the time of my film. There was a great documentary on Discovery Times channel that went in detail through Phil Van Praag's key findings, and then I made an epilogue to my film where I went and met Phil, and he went through his key findings with me. And this is basically him mapping the audio on the recording. It's the only known recording of the gunshots. It was pretty much ignored by the LAPD and the FBI at the time, but subsequently it was rediscovered by CNN reporter Brad Johnson. He found Phil Van Praag, asked him to analyze it, and his key findings after months of work analyzing the recording, which obviously, as you've heard, isn't a particularly clear recording, were that there were 13 shot sounds and 2 double shots, which means that there were 2 shots that happened so close together they couldn't have been fired from the same gun. Literally there was less than a second between them, which more evidence there were 2 guns fired that night. And also when he analyzed the frequencies of the gunshots, he was able to group them. So the frequencies of 8 of the shots matched, and the frequencies of 5 of the shots matched. And he did some test firing with a model of a gun very similar to Sirhan's and very similar to Payne Eugene Caesar's. And with those independent tests, he was able to match those frequencies and basically group the 8 shots coming in front of Kennedy and the 5 shots from behind. So he's able to map out exactly what he had suspected in terms of his working hypothesis, that indeed the fatal shot came from behind and Sirhan was in front. And actually, while he felled 5 bystanders, he wasn't responsible for the fatal shot that killed Kennedy. So here we have Sirhan, one of the more famous shots of him just after his arrest in the pantry, and you can see there he's wild-eyed and really has very little idea where he is or what's happened, which is borne out if you listen to the audio of him in custody, which is on the website I mentioned, sirhanvsirhan.com. I put it all up there during the earlier campaign this year. He really is out of it. He doesn't know where he is. The lingering effects of the 4 Tom Collins. And obviously he'd blacked out and he couldn't remember the moments leading up to the shooting until he was actually choked on the steam table and almost killed, and people were shouting, "Let's not have another Oswald," they wanted justice in the case. So some of the key, post-crime evidence of Manchurian Candidate are the psychiatric recordings of Sirhan reenacting the shooting in trance. So it was a very unusual case in the sense that the defense allowed the prosecution psychiatrist to also examine the key suspect. So the defense and prosecution psychiatrists got together. They had several sessions in Sirhan's cell leading up to the trial, and some of that all of that was recorded on audio. So it's just an incredible recording of Sirhan being put under hypnosis and reenacting the shooting and really having no memory of some of the key details. So you can listen to it yourself. It's in my film and it's also online. But it vindicates his story that he really had no memory, and that only that memory comes up to the surface when he's in trance and he can begin to process it. I think almost as an extension of that then, Dr. Herbert Spiegel, who was a 50-year expert on hypnosis, had earlier tried to get in to see Sirhan in prison since his trial with Larry Teeter, I think in the 80s and 90s, but never succeeded. But then Dr. Dan Brown came and he picked up the baton, and he went in 2008. And one of his key findings, you can read Dr. Brown's report. He produced one for the last parole hearing in 2011, and he produced another one for this parole hearing in 2016. And it's really startling, the work that he's done with Sirhan, because not just over 100 hours trying to regress and remember more of the details about the shooting, but also 3 instances of Sirhan entering range mode on production of the right cue word to trigger this post-hypnotic assassin. So the programming that was used to turn Sirhan into a Manchurian candidate and be given this cue or this keyword by the girl in the polka dot dress on the night itself was still working over 40 years later with the right probing in trance by Dr. Dan Brown. So what he described was Sirhan entering range mode, seeing firing targets, which basically correlate to the firing range where he'd spent the afternoon before he went to the Ambassador Hotel that evening, and then Sirhan firing at a target, not firing at Bobby Kennedy, but firing at a target. And when he sees Bobby Kennedy, he's been conditioned to see basically a target that he's free firing at. And Dr. Dan Brown, in the period since 2008, has observed that 3 times of Sirhan in the jail, still replicating this behavior, which is, to me, is just really scary in terms of the strength of this program that he was put under. So we still don't know. I mean, obviously there are ideas of suspects in terms of MKUltra doctors who may have worked with Sirhan on this, but the detail is a little bit fuzzy. But I think between that and the Brzezinski recording and the firing positions and the body position of Sirhan at the time of the shooting, I think it all adds up to very, very strong evidence that he wasn't the killer of Bobby Kennedy. I think one of the other key features of the case has been the girl in the polka dot dress, and I see Fernando Fora's book is on sale at the back here from Trine Day, and I mean it's a quest to find a girl in the polka dot dress that I've continued to do since I interviewed Sandra Serrano for my film. So just to give you a bit of detail on that, Sandra Serrano, she saw the girl in the polka dot dress running down the stairs saying, "We shot Kennedy, we killed him." Vincent De Piero was the other key witness. He was in the pantry, and he saw the girl in the polka dot dress standing with Sirhan on the tray stacker and then disappearing from the pantry after the shooting. And then there was also a character called John Fahey, which I go into his story in my book. On the morning of the assassination, he was due to make a sales call, and he was on the road all day as a salesman, and he was due to have a meeting in the cafe of the Ambassador Hotel. And he met a very strange woman who later called herself Gilderdine Oppenheimer, and took her. He basically took her. He took her out with him on his sales calls that day, and she told him basically that they were being followed, that she was afraid they were going to kill her, and that she was with the group who were going to take care of Kennedy at the hotel that night. And she tried to get him to accompany him to the hotel, but he said, "No, I have to go home to my wife." But in retrospect, after what happened at the hotel that night, he began to tell the police and tell reporter Fernando Fara and tell the FBI his story. And it's a very strange story with some very strange connections. She said that she had just come from New York, that she had been, I think, flown in from Aqaba or from the Middle East, and that she had just met with Mrs. Chenault. Anna Chenault, as we know, later in 1968, was the person who kept the South Vietnamese away from the Paris peace talks and away from the boost that would have maybe kept the Democrats and Hubert Humphrey in power. Instead, said, they delayed their involvement in the Paris peace talks, and Nixon won a very, very tight election. So I had a very interesting experience earlier in the year where I met Fernando Fora in Washington, D.C., and we went to the Watergate complex where Madame Chennault's penthouse apartment still is. This is where she entertained Nixon and all his cronies in the late 60s, just to basically confront her and say, you know, did you know this girl she claimed to have met you 3 days before the assassination? And, you know, she's 91 years old and she wasn't very forthcoming, and I'm not too sure there's very much there, to be honest. But the girl did say that she was going to get out of, after the shooting and her complicity in the shooting, she was going to leave the States through San Francisco on a military plane with CAT, which is Civil Air Transport, which is a precursor to the Flying Tiger Line, which Madame Chennault was a vice president of, and which can be traced back to Air America and Civil Air Transport going, you know, basically they were some of the airlines that the CIA used in Southeast Asia at the time. So very intriguing connections that Fernando Fora tries to follow up in his book, and that I tried to get at by meeting Anna Chennault earlier in the year. So this is Anna Chennault here. You can see her with Kennedy, who appointed her as a special advisor to some sort of cultural committee in the early 60s. And then she was very tight to Nixon and Kissinger. She raised over $250,000 for Nixon's 68 campaign. So an intriguing figure, but one of the difficult things about this case is you get these fascinating, tantalizing leads, but you can't quite, you know, get the hard evidence to really pin them down any further. So the SirhanBSirhan.com website that I mentioned, just to list some of the materials you can find on there if you want to go up there. It's the audio of Sirhan's first hours in custody, the audio of him reenacting the shooting under hypnosis, the jail logs of Sirhan's first year in custody, which I found absolutely fascinating, were only released about 5 years ago, transcripts of all the different parole hearings, video of his previous parole hearings, various articles that I did on the 2016 parole hearing, and the media ban. So this is just some photos of Sirhan with his first attorney. Then this is a very rare photograph that I just found earlier in this year of Sirhan in his jail cell in August '68. This had never been seen before. And then this is a book, again it's kind of clipped off a little bit, but this is a book I did, an ebook that I did earlier in the year around this campaign called In Jail with Sirhan. So what had happened was all the sheriff's files were released in 2011. There was some 10 rolls of microfilm. And so part of those were the sheriff's deputy statements, where basically every day they were told, write down what Sirhan's doing, what he's eating, any strange behavior, and what he says. Just maybe some of this material can be used at the trial. So there's about 4,000 pages of basically sheriff's deputies who are sitting with Sirhan, cataloging his every move, and it's really fascinating reading. So I took 400 pages of those and made them into an ebook called In Jail with Sirhan. And one of the pages of that, I don't know if you can read it there. It's actually taken a day after he did the key reenactment of the shooting with the psychiatrist. And so it says, Sir, during my tour, I had the following conversation with inmate Sirhan. After Dr. Pollock's departure, inmates stated, these damn doctors, they don't understand the mind themselves. Mills, did you know that I can't remember pulling the trigger, killing Kennedy? I want to know exactly, but I just can't remember. The doctors say that I can recall everything when put to sleep. Why can't I recall now? I replied, I don't know, Sirhan. Inmate then stated, the mind is sure complicated. I would like to know where the energy comes from that feeds the brain. Wouldn't you? I replied, yes, I would. And you know, so it kind of verifies where he was at, basically, in 20s. Got commuted to a life sentence. I'm just going to skip on down here. So this is him actually being committed to his sentence, May 23rd, 1969, and this is him now. So these are some of the most recent mugshots just prior to his 2016 parole hearing, and these are some AP photos from the hearing itself. So you can see what he's like now with one of his lead attorneys, Bill Pepper. And you know, just a very calm, thoughtful, well-educated guy who got a college degree during the 70s, during his imprisonment, and is very well-read and very open-minded. And obviously now, I think I've lost my microphone. And obviously now he has the trust of Paul Schrade, because I think one of the key things here is that after many years, Paul Schrade felt almost embarrassed to turn up at his parole hearing this year, because for a long time he was associated closely with the Kennedy family. He didn't want to get muddied up in Sirhan's case. I think he was embarrassed because he hadn't been there, and he hadn't been there for Sirhan, even though we all felt there was a second gunman involved. So it was a very personal and emotional public statement by Paul Schrade, both at the hearing, which, as we know, they wouldn't allow video, they wouldn't allow audio. They did audio, they recorded audio so they could make a transcript, but they refused to share it with us afterwards. So just an incredibly closed kind of system. But Paul Schrade really is one of the key campaigners who can help us to try and get the media attention to reopen this case. And one of the key supporters of Paul Schrade in this is Robert Kennedy Jr., who now has publicly come out and supported the case. So you can see Paul Schrade very angry and just disgusted at the treatment of Sirhan at the parole hearing. Trying to shake hands with Sirhan, but being stopped by guards at the end of the hearing. This is one of the other attorney, Laurie Dusick. And then Sirhan, pondering his fate, and obviously, with seemingly little hope of parole. I mean, he would be, one of the key questions about parole is this guy still a danger to society? And you've seen, it's just ridiculous. 72-year-old with valley fever in 2011 in the clip that we saw, he would probably be deported as an illegal alien because his visa is up. He never became an American citizen. So he would be deported if he was released. So he's no threat to anybody, but still they just hold him as a scapegoat for the crime itself. And just my last slide, this is Bobby Kennedy Jr., who again is very close to Paul Schrade. They redeveloped the Ambassador Hotel through Paul Schrade and the help of the Kennedy family. And this is what he said in a book published earlier this year. For several decades, my father's close friend Paul Schrade, who took one of Sirhan's bullets, has argued that Sirhan did not fire the shot that killed my father. Recent forensic evidence supports him. How would we have felt now if our family had demanded his execution? And actually, there was a very famous letter written by Ted Kennedy at the time of the trial, pleading for them not to give the death sentence to Sirhan, but the judge and jury denied that, and he was given the death sentence. But then, because the law changed, he was reprieved. But for all intents and purposes, if the law hadn't changed, he'd now be dead, and this would be an academic kind of issue. So with that, I'll just leave you with some of my work if you want to go and browse it in more detail. My book is available on Kindle or through whokilledbobby.net, and my DVDs are available on DVD and VOD streaming at the websites that you see on the screen there. So thanks very much for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, Shane O'Sullivan. Looks like we have a couple questions, but we're a little bit tight on our schedule.
Very quickly, I'd like to say you were talking about that you'd like to have more information about Chanel.
Yeah.
Well, I may have a little bit for you. Claire Chanel died of lung cancer in Alton Oxner's Hospital, and they were best friends. And when Anna went, before she talked to anybody else, she sat down in his own biography, written by his own, with his approval, that she sat down and talked to him about what they're going to do about Nixon and about making sure the war, they don't have the talks. So that's how deeply Alton Oxner was involved in all of this. And this lung cancer death was in '57, and it's a part of the idea they had about giving lung cancer to Castro, for example. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Shane.
Hi.
One of my more proud moments of this conference is being able to recruit Shane to come here from England.
Yeah, thank
you. And you have to give Judyth credit for the logistics and the expense to bring him across the pond. It's probably her greatest coup in terms of this conference. Now, on top of that, I corresponded with Sirhan decades ago, and in 1975, when I was 28, we had a conference at my alma mater, Boston University, and all the researchers at the time were there. And one of the first RFK researchers, Ted Chirac, brought his film, the original Second Gun, and showed it. But he also brought another small film. And in the film, Bobby Kennedy, if I recall it correctly, it's been 40 years, he was up at the podium, and there was a dark-skinned man in front, and he was staring out at the audience, very sincere, very, I guess, focused, very serious. Everybody else was celebrating, and he took his 3 fingers of his right hand, and 3 times he went like this. 3 times. It was a signal, very clearly. And then Bobby goes off and gets killed. And the film has never surfaced anywhere. And I talked to Phil Melanson, who was my friend who wrote an RFK book. He knew nothing about it. His library archives down there in Massachusetts, they knew nothing about it. I contacted, I sent the material to Sirhan. I sent him pictures of what I thought was the guy. I wasn't quite sure. Sirhan turned that information over to his legal researcher, Rosalind Mangwin, who called me. I sent her the materials. She asked me to send it to Sirhan's brother, Sharif. I did. I never heard from either one of them again, but I sent it. I became friends with Larry Tito, one of Sirhan's lawyers. I gave him the material, and then unfortunately he died. Shane and I were talking about this night. Chirac and Larry Tito did not get along. That film has never been seen. All the pros don't know anything about it. I've talked to James Douglas, who wrote the great JFK book, and it went there. At any rate, it's important that we find it. And one last thing quickly. I'm friends also, email friends with Paul Schrade, and he sent me the transcript of the parole hearing, and you might be able to find it on the internet. And the important thing is he talks about the 13 shots. He calls the parole board venomous. Dr. Pepper talks about 2 shooters. They just keep shutting him down. And the most important thing is the parole hearing was in all the newspapers that he was denied, but that's it. And they mentioned Paul Schrade on going there on his behalf. But all the important information about conspiracy is not in any of the major news outlets, and that's where the mass media has been a disgrace. Thank you very much, sir. Great job.
And thanks for suggesting being here. Yeah, I just wanted to say as well, I think the 50th anniversary of the Bobby Kennedy case is coming up in 2018, and obviously Paul Schrade is 91 years old, and then if he goes, then maybe the connection to the Kennedy family goes as well. So for me, I think 2018 is really our last chance to do something with this case, so I'd appreciate your support if you spread the word. That would be great. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to try and do something a little bit different. We do have a few minutes it's going to take for us to set up our next computer, get ready for our next presentation. So let's try having questions still with Shane while we're doing that, if you don't mind. Would that be okay? Okay.
In 1998, when I came to Texas for the first time, Paul O'Connor and I met and talked with Larry Teeter.
Yeah.
In 2000, Larry Teeter came to my home in Hoopston, Illinois, and talked to my kids and my family. He also gave me a VCR tape because at that time he was the appeals attorney, I think, for Sirhan. And I don't know whether you were aware of that tape that he had, but if you would like to have a copy of it, just come talk to me.
All right, great. No, I will. Yeah, I will. And no, I met Larry just shortly before he died. He was Sirhan's attorney from '94 to 2006, I think. And I mean, he's played a heroic role, and hero is the word, in terms of starting the habeas corpus petition on behalf of Sirhan that was then taken up by Pepper and Disick later.
Real quick, anyone ever found Don Shulman?
No, I mean I've spoken to his wife, and she wouldn't pass the phone to Don. So I think he still lives in Orange County. I mean he still lives in LA and he's still around, but I think he was so burned by his treatment in the media at the time of the Chirac film that he's never re-entered the case. But I think he still is alive, so maybe he can still play a role. Yeah, so it's worth remembering. I mean, he was the one who saw 3 shots erupt on Kennedy's body, and he saw a guard with a gun firing, and he was one of the only ones to see that. So he is a key witness, but he's, because he's been so burned in the early 70s, he's reluctant to re-enter the case and really join us in this effort.
Shane, are there any other suspects for the second shooter other than Caesar?
That's been the difficulty. I mean, I can't think of any at the moment. Obviously, in my film, I have the CIA suspects at the hotel, and David Morales of the CIA is on record as saying he was there on the night. And in my mind, I definitely, having made my Killing Oswald film as well, I definitely connected to, and I believe that the same people were behind both assassinations. But in terms of who the shooter was, I don't know if we'll ever know. But I mean, in my mind, in order to reopen a case, all you have to do is prove that Sirhan wasn't the one who fired the fatal shot. Therefore, there was a conspiracy and it's been unsolved. He should be able to get out of jail. He's been eligible for parole since the 80s anyway. But for officialdom to acknowledge that it's an unsolved case, it's the ultimate, one of the ultimate, along with the JFK assassination cold case. And we should look at it. So I think the fact that the CIA historian has admitted that the CIA covered up evidence in the aftermath of Dallas is maybe a first step to 50 years later, being at least partially truthful and releasing some records about these cases. So that's my hope, that we can try and do something in 2018 to make the most of the media exposure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
What are your thoughts on the similarities between the Sirhan case and the James Holmes shooting in the Aurora Theater, with all the similarities there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously some of those similarities were brought out in the press. I can't say I know the details of the case too much, so I can't really comment on it, but I don't know the details of the case, to be honest.
Hi Shane, thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you.
Thoroughly enjoyed your documentary.
Thank you.
From what I gathered today with the presentation, are we to assume that they knew Gene Caesar is still alive today?
Yeah.
Okay. Any idea where he is?
He's believed to be in the Philippines, but I guess only author Dan Moldea really knows.
Okay.
Because, I mean, when I spoke to him, it's 10 years ago now, but when I spoke to him, he was speaking to him on a weekly basis and fielding offers from TV companies about like him doing the ultimate interview. So in a way, he still is alive. I mean, I don't know if there's not little point in really interviewing him for media purposes, but in terms of being deposed or tested, being subpoenaed, that's something that could still happen because he's still around. And really, he's never been properly investigated.
Just a quick second question as well.
Yeah.
The Polkadot girl, whatever her role was in this group or this operation, tell us why maybe you think she would just come out publicly and just shout that publicly that we just shot RFK.
Yeah,
thank you.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any rational sense, but then nothing about this case does. So, you drive yourself crazy trying to, make everything fit a rational master plan sometimes. But I think obviously the whole Manchurian Candidate, with that kind of thing, you need a trigger, and and a personification of a trigger in terms of a beautiful girl who leads him mysteriously into the pantry, and there's a certain amount of sexual arousal that you read into suggestion that maybe been part of the programming and may have been something that really intensified the programming in his mind. So she was just a prop to be used as part of the plan. Who she was, I mean, I think the John Fahey story is very interesting. I had another lead that I'm pursuing to a certain extent of a woman who was living in Long Beach who fits the description. I've seen photographs of her years before and years after. But again, I can only take it so far. So I think rather than searching for a needle in a haystack in terms of putting a name on these faces or these figures, I think it's more important just to acknowledge that there was a plot and to get the authorities to try and investigate it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, Shane, thanks
Hi.
again. I think we all really, really enjoyed that. I just wanted to make two statements. The first was, Ed Tatro was talking about the transcript of the last parole, and if you read that at the end, what they say, why they turn him down, is that he does not have sufficient remorse for the crime. Exactly. So what you've just seen, and if you read more, you see that how could anyone have a remorse for a crime they don't remember committing?
Yeah.
But why I'm asking you this question is really self-serving. The girl in the polka dot dress. So with my co-writer and I, we are putting a play together that hopefully will launch on the anniversary of the assassination of RFK. We are eagerly seeking anybody's perspective on who that girl might be. So there are several theories. We have our own that we're trying to come up with. I just heard you have another lead, which is great. But if anybody here has a thought about where we might look for that, to take that further, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's an important point as well that we all work together, and do as many different media type events to drive this forward, because that's really where we're going to get it out of research circles into the public mind. Okay, sure.
Good morning, Shane. Thank you for being here. I watched RFK Must Die when it first came out, and I only have about 62,000 questions, but I'll try. The shadowy guys, one was tied, I think it was to the Elgin Watch Company that was the president. There were some people. Bulova. There were odd people in that audience. Number one, did any of those leads pan out? And number two, was anything made of the fact that the guy that debriefed or questioned Sandra Serrano in the LAPD was tied to higher intelligence and actually basically tried to get her to recant her whole story, which she wouldn't. Yeah. And third, there was some grooming going on with Sirhan as far as Rosicrucianism and things that were going on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. I think I went into quite a lot of that in my book in terms of the Bulova lead. Bulova was a national, as well as being a famous watch company, they were a national security contractor who did, they did millions of pounds or millions of dollars in contracts, and they had a major World War II general on their, as chairman of the company. So even when I found out that was a watch company and ostensibly there for a sales meeting, you never know if that's a cover for something else, and it leads you down the rabbit hole a little bit in terms of trying to piece that together. I think, what was the other question, sorry?
The intelligence agent and Sandra Serrano, that he wasn't just...
Right, sorry, Han Hernandez, he's a very interesting figure. Basically he was on foreign assignment with AID, which is a front for the CIA in South America in the early 60s. And then subsequently, he had CIA links all over the place, as well as did Manny Pena, who was the lieutenant who was basically the head of the investigation. And then subsequently, when he retired from LAPD, Hank Hernandez went on to, I think his obituary says, from his kitchen table, he planned this security company whose first contract was with NASA, which is quite fortunate, and is now a multi-billion-dollar company in the hands of his family, and his family are now so, elite and prestigious that I think his son ended up on the boards of McDonald's and Wells Fargo and the LA Times, and good luck to you if you want to publish a story on this case in the LA Times, because Hernandez is still on the board to stop you. So you can see in terms of the the evidence out there in terms of what they did later in their career, that there was a lot at stake, and they successfully shut it down, which is what they were there to do. And luckily, we still have the audio tapes of Serrano to show how biased that process was in terms of deflecting any evidence of a conspiracy and shutting it down within weeks. Basically,
Thank you very much, Shane. Were there any drugs involved in this MK Ultra kind of thing? And what about Reagan? Was that attempted assassination also somewhat fishy?
Yeah, when I spoke to Dr. Spiegel from my film, he actually says alcohol and drugs actually make the hypnotic conditioning more difficult because they cloud your mental process, and they actually would work against something like that. So he wasn't so sure about that drugs would play a part. But obviously the fact that his blood, they didn't take a blood sample and test it for drugs to see if he was high, it was just ridiculous that they didn't do that in the hours after the shooting. And again, there may have been a malign motive behind that if they had foreknowledge of what went on. In terms of the Reagan shooting, I don't know enough about it to really connect it together. What I do know is that a lot of these guys, Arthur Bremer, who shot George Wallace in '72, he's been released. Hinckley has been released. All these guys are getting released, but Sirhan is the last man standing in terms of, the last famous so-called political assassin who, is still bearing the burden of all this many years later. So, yeah.
Okay. A couple of brief questions.
Unfortunately, we're beyond time. We're way over time.
You're beyond time for court briefing.
Yes, we are way over.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Kratos Sullivan.